As a republic, we support and revere the opportunity of our laws to be effectuated and by the consent of the governed. This consent comes in form of majority rule with certain protections which the majority have at some point consented to and continue to accept. These are accepted for the unassailable and protected rights of all, and done by limitations on the ability of the majority to pursue certain actions. The fundamental flaw of this form of government is similar to all other forms of government. Whether the determination is made by 50% plus one, or by a committee, or by a king, the determination can be wrong. It can be against the best interests of the people. It can be immoral to all standards of society. It can be unethical and perverse. All nations and governments have struggled with this. It was due to a long series of injustices and abuses that this nation's founders sought new guardians for their posterity. Today, we have the ugly and sad reality of dealing with the tragic flight of our people to call what is repugnant and shocking a fundamental right. Through the loss of understanding and connection to any truth, and despite the cognitive dissonance, the acceptance of pernicious lies, our state has blithely entrenched the rights within its own constitution that fly in the face of long-held values, the very values of this nation's founding. The preeminent document of our nation's founding, the Declaration of Independence, declares that life itself is an inalienable right. And we've all heard the quip, two wrongs don't make a right. And that is what is before us today. A second wrong to pile on top of the first wrong. As I alluded to, this isn't the first time this has happened. At our nation's founding, particularly at the framing of the Constitution, slavery was seen as an incongruous blemish on the nation. But how to end it was not easily answered. Huge sums of money were tied up in the people considered property. Businesses and industry depended on it. Loans that were collateralized with it. Society was structured around it. Jefferson himself described it as having a wolf by the ears. And so the founders compromised and created a plan that would wean the nation off of it. After all, they thought, it's not likely to endure. This, of course, didn't work, and for several factors, not the least of which was racism. Many folks, removed from viewing the abomination of slavery in the eventually freed North, casually opposed slavery, but were unmotivated to act on it personally or politically. Then John C. Calhoun of South Carolina changed the whole paradigm by declaring that slavery was a moral good, a noble enterprise.
Senator, while the history can be appreciated, please tailor your remarks to the contents of this bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my remarks will tie together.
Let's proceed with the content of the bill in your remarks.
Mr. President, the point I'm making will tie together with the content of my speech, please.
President recognizes Senator McBroom.
Thank you, Mr. President. They declared that it was a moral good, an imperative, and a service to people. And suddenly good people were confronted with their moral laziness regarding it, and abolition became an imperative. So much so that it became a litmus test for candidates, parties, clergy, journalists, and even families. We know what happened next, and I encourage you to read John F. Kennedy's book. It's an amazing book called Profiles in Courage, to learn more about the political battles. Why do I bring this up now? I believe that the parallels in the present debate on abortion merit this. Just a few years ago, abortion was largely panned by many as being an unfortunate but occasionally necessary option. Joe Biden said he believed every abortion was a tragedy. Bill Clinton said, sadly but firmly, that it should be safe, legal, and rare. But in the last 10 to 15 years, that paradigm has taken a dramatic shift, a John C. Calhoun shift. Even here in this chamber, we've heard that abortion is a good thing, a moral, desirable thing, that should be celebrated. The consequences of that shift are also comparable. Many who easily tolerated abortion have been shaken to their core, and they've had to face and evaluate whether their opposition is merited or not. And if it is, how can they live honestly without actively opposing it? And the answer for many is emphatically, no, this can't be justified or tolerated. As I've said before, come, let us reason together. Advocates contend that those opposing abortion cannot speak to it because they're not women. This is nonsense, because what's wrong and what is right is never contingent on who is speaking. It wasn't that way for slavery. It wasn't only them that could speak to the injustice. It also ignores the rights of others who are involved, fathers in particular. It treats all women as being monolithic and ignores that women overwhelmingly lead the cause for pro-life, and it disregards the very life of the unborn themselves. This Calhoun paradigm shift is so shocking that people are actually testifying now that those who are living, that there are those living who ought to have been abortion, and that they and we would be better off if they had been. They further conclude that the autonomy of one person is more important than defining the difference of a baby 10 seconds before delivery versus 10 seconds after delivery. Here and everywhere, we hear repeatedly the cognitive dissonance of those celebrating the lives they themselves birthed, even speaking about it as a life prior to delivery, while incoherently declaring the disposability of the exact same situation when it's not wanted. Come, let us reason together. What sets apart those who have a right to life? If it's only by the consent of others, we're in serious jeopardy. Some say dependence sets apart the unborn. But what is 10 minutes for dependence? What about 10-year-olds? What about 30-year-olds and 100-year-olds, all of which can be dependent at some stage in their life? It can't be based on that. And it can't be based on the idea that it's a tumor or unwanted growth. A baby has its own DNA, its own blood type. It's undeniably a human being, breathing, growing, a distinguishable individual. It can't be on circumstances. Slavery was repugnant, whether the master was kind or not, whether the options outside of slavery were good or not. Some claimed, but it's obviously untrue and offensive to suggest it. Likewise, while the circumstances around conception or in a home after birth may be tragic or appalling, it doesn't alter the value of the life. How could it? Even a consideration of circumstances of tragedy each of us face on a daily basis undermines the very notion that a value of life is determined by circumstance. Even injustice doesn't alter this reality. This is easily demonstrated by those harmed in war, in accidents, by drugs or alcohol. Whether the trauma and physical impact are caused by themselves or by others, we still value these lives. We still hold them sacred and worthy. If this is true of someone debilitated or mentally impaired by their own drug use, similarly, the circumstances surrounding conception and birth don't alter the morality or value of the unborn. This is a difficult and tough time for our nation. Many good people find themselves defending what is, upon sincere reflection, simply indefensible. But the trials and difficulties and opportunities that motivate the acceptance and compromises they're willing to make are real. Abortion does offer real relief. It does solve problems. It can save a person many other trials. These realities have to be compassionately considered and understood. Poverty and a broken home can make having a baby very, very tragic. Having a baby can interfere with carefully laid plans for the future. Having a baby can decimate your finances. Families do get torn apart by the arrival of a new baby. Those who are opposing abortion can't simply ignore the other lives because they're succeeding in saving the lives of the unborn. Real people who argue about these need to be able to come to terms and recognize this, that both the born and the unborn are people. Let us all strive to be people convicted of the need of care for all the living, particularly those who are suffering, defenseless, victimized, and outcasts. But circumstances can never obviate the truth and reality. Just because robbing a bank meets the immediate need doesn't make it legal. Just because someone might ruin my life doesn't justify me assaulting them or murdering them. Circumstances of economics or other needs don't alter what is true. While every circumstance may have multiple victims, we do not, as a practice of law or humanity, ever discount the victim who lost the most, in this case, the baby. We have to join the champions of the past, who took up the fight against slavery, which was statutorily declared to be ethical and moral. They were tireless and dauntless. John Quincy Adams led the way, who, like William Wilberforce, repeatedly attempted to end it, repeatedly introducing resolutions to end it, despite vehement denunciations, despite collective demonization, and repeated use of stolen language to mischaracterize and effectively cancel his efforts. Despite the accusation that he was contending against the very Constitution he swore an oath to uphold, he persisted because, like Wilberforce, like Bonhoeffer, like Cicero, he fought for what was right regardless of what was necessary or expedient or declared legal by the government. The repeal of these sections of law from 1931 is nothing less than an endorsement of the very sentiments expressed in the amendment that passed last fall. The difference is, and I don't think that point would be argued differently by anyone here, the difference is that our peril is greater because we do not enter this decision with a lack of information or being deceived. We enter it with eyes wide open and without any eventual claim to ignorance or good intentions. I've heard this law recently categorized as antiquated, but there's no way to antiquate the protecting of life. What new information do we have now? What enlightenment do we use for justification? All the new information we have from science works against the idea that the lives of the unborn are just that, real lives, distinctive human individuals, not a lump of cells or a blob of tissues. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. I ask for my remarks to be printed in the journal.